This is Pedro from Skyblivion here to show you how to do some effects. To prepare for this, I have created a test little area using some of my project's assets as well as some of Skyrim's assets to create a hodgepodge that will serve as our palette for us to work upon. Now, in this case, we have a clusterfuck of rocks, and that is to be expected when you're creating a ceiling using something without tiles. So when we go down here, we will actually see what I was doing. So in this area, we have our little murder scene. Multiple people have been killed in various different fashions. Traps have been laid out, and the area has been not necessarily heavily cluttered, but cluttered enough for us to get our point of what we're coming across today. So in this case, we're going to be going over effects, because as you see here, this creating the location is only half of what we're supposed to be doing here. We have to sell the area. We have to give it some importance, and in some ways, we have to accentuate what we already see here. Case in point, stalactites. They are created from moisture, right? So stalactites drip. So we will be talking about drip effects. Lighting itself here, you're not going to see flat lighting like this. This would make an area boring. Counter, you don't want this to happen to your interior as well. So we'll be going over applied lighting, and we'll be going over ambient lighting here as well. So here we're going to first start with lighting. Since we have this when we turn lighting off, we are going to go to cells, select your region here, go under lighting and ambient lighting. All zeros is pure black, all 255 is all white. In this case, I go to about 15 on each, which will allow for a more... It's still dark, still hard to see, but it's visible. Now, before we start going towards anything outside of ambient, we have to understand that ambient itself is not where you stop. Ambient by itself will create flat lighting no matter what setting you put it to. We are just creating a base so we can actually move forward with something else. So in order to help us light it up more dynamically, we are going to use different types of light. So case in point, we're going to go to Bleak Falls because they have a couple types. You'll have show markers once again. Where is this? All right, so we have a shadow light. You'll have a hemi-light, which is half the area. You can rotate it to change its hemisphere influence. And you will have things such as this is a cone of influence. This is a directional light, all right? And then you'll have just a normal omni light, all right? So these are your 4 types of lights that you're going to be seeing here. All right, this is a non-shadow. This is its own little thing. This will put light everywhere in its radius. Shadow lights will actually adhere to the mesh's sides, and the directional here will focus only in how it's projecting. So you see this little cone of influence here, where the Omni here does the same thing with the Omni non-shadow, but it will actually adhere to meshes around it. The hemisphere will only go above the green circle here, and for its hemisphere shape, hence its name. So the reason why these are distinct and why we have not just shadow lights is that there are limitations, where a shadow light can only be used 4 times in one cell. Non-shadow lights can be used 4 times per nitri shape. And nitri shapes are little distinctions we put inside our meshes to put different texture settings, such as our normals and other little things there. But what happens is when more than 4 lights touch this, 1 light will be flickered off at random. All right, we can't select which one does it, which one doesn't. So in this case, we are going to go for a perspective of keeping below 4. The issue with this is we also have to understand that when players use Major Light, Torchlight, or a torch, this also counts as a light source. So we have to limit the number of lights we place down to 3 per nitride shape. And since we can try to assume we can't always assume how many nitride shapes we have, we're going for the minimalistic approach and say 3 light sources can hit 1 mesh at a time. Unless you understand that there is more than 1 nitride shape that's dividing these areas up, and you can accurately keep them parsed. All right? So, in this case, now that we have talked a little bit about what these lightings mean, we're actually going to now talk about choosing the right type, the right radius, and how to apply it. So first off, we're going to look at the scene like this. I'm going to delete all these little light sources because they are just going to be in the way, and we want our shadow light limit to be back down to 0. So, we're back at our little scene, and we have a couple little markers that I've set that will tell us where some of our light sources are going to be. This is a set of candles, and there is a set of candles over here. So, if we go back to our little lighting template here, we see our dark room. Now we're going to place a light symbol. This is sunlight. It is, well, let's go for a Omni non-shadow. This is a little too bright for our taste, all right? Because since we're trying to sell a spooky environment, we're going to go for more faded colors. We're going for something that does not show everything clearly. So this case, this will be more for sunbeams coming down, and you can use other effects like dust beams to carry out a more special effect in this area. What we're going to be focusing here is under the Alec here section. One of my favorite little guys here. Let's go off of the orange little flicker. This has a little bit more to it. It allows for a little bit, it's a lot clearer from this distance, but it's nowhere near as bright, and it kind of fades well with our ground around us. Now, if we click on this, hold the S key, and drag our mouse up and down, we can change the radius. So, if we drag it closer, it hides more details, but at the same time, it keeps other areas darker, so it allows for more tense areas. So we have to counterbalance this. We want our light to display what we want to show, but at the same time keep it minimalistic and keep it tense for this environment, because our goal is to keep the player on edge. Without light, the player is at a disadvantage, and they are not going to be able to feel like they dominate this environment. So having just enough light to show context clues, such as the feet of the person here who has been shot with a few arrows, can sell this area. Now, considering the light source's impact here, a non-shadow light is fine, but a shadow light would get better results. But given our limitation here, this is not as bad as it could be. So, going over here, we have another candle source. But this time, there are a bunch of stuff around it that we kind of want to accentuate. So this time, we'll be using the shadow light. And you'll notice the impact is a little bit greater. As it follows the mesh here, it'll cast a shadow because the light will not pass this opaque mesh. And because there is a wall here, you will not see it hit the other side here. Shadow lights are great when you're going up against a wall like this, because an Omni light may just light this area up if you increase the radius too much. And keeping it within the confines here, we also want to have the player not be able to see the light right off the bat from here. So the default radius actually works in our favor. Now, if you look here, we have all these little environment pieces. We have wisp stalks. This is an Oblivion asset. You don't have this in Skyrim. But these guys are known to project very faded forms of light. So I'm going to go for a other little form here called the Shroom Light. This guy creates a little faded room spot like this. It's enough to give some context, but not nearly enough light to know everything that's going on. You may see a little bit of the guy with the sword here. It will not show the bear trap that is right next to it. And it keeps the player from being able to discern too much from the environment, but at the same time give him some light to have. We can go into this object window and type wisp stalk, because I have quite a few here. And we can place multiple light sources around. Keeping in mind that we have to stay 3's the limit here. So we have 3 lights here touching this one mesh here. So we got to make sure the lights on the other areas don't touch it. So light source here. This will not touch the cliff over there, so we can properly place one here. This one is not going to be useful because it'll touch this and hit our 4 limit. So we want to move this. And let's say about right here. This will allow me to put light here in a more crucial spot. So we now have an area that looks like this. Minor lights. Not too much can be discerned, so the player is going to have to rely on a torch. And depending on the themes you're going to be using, this is either what you want to a T or something you will not want. So for a cave where your goal is to be more tense, it's more natural, this kind of lighting is fine. But when you're focusing on something like a house, your ambient lighting is actually going to go up significantly, but not to the point where it lights up everything, because we still want a dynamic environment. We still want our lights to stand out. We will just have a higher ambient lighting in that area so players can still see when we're actually just showing some visual effects to disguise the fact of lighting. So now that we have all of these guys lit up, we are going to focus on the other aspect. Because now we're moving from lighting to the other little visual effects. Namely, we're going to be focusing on both vectored visual effects, which is decals, and regional visual effects. So you'll see cylindrical markers that I will place down that'll tell us what we can do. So first off, a vector will pull an arrow and it'll point to where the decal is going to be placed. So in this case, we're going to be dealing with blood decals. So you'll find decals like this. They'll have this NDE symbol here. Now, this person died in combat, so we're going to deal with, let's say, a medium small. So we get this arrow. Wherever the arrow points, blood is splattered. Skyrim is a little well known to over apply its blood. So sometimes if it's a less gruesome fight, we're going to use stuff like this to show significant blood loss, but at the same time, we are going to apply it properly. Person's a little bit exsanguinated. And every once in a while, you'll have to refresh because decals can be a bit wonky. They'll overwrite themselves, but still render as if one's also placed next to it. So in this case, the tiny is a little too small for a murder wound, so we're going to go for small. That is a bit more gruesome. We'll refresh just to be sure that what we want is what we're getting. And that probably is the best for me. So, as you can see though, if you look closely, there is a sharp line here. Because there are limitations to these decals. They can only influence a certain number of nitride shapes at one point. If you have multiple different assets in place here, you can see some incompatibilities with your decals, but in this case, it's very minor. So most players will not notice it. Though it will still haunt your mind every time you're doing interiors and see decals clipping that you have placed. So going for further decal movement, this person has a little bit more to deal with. It's no longer just someone who died in combat, it's a person who's been impaled, pinned down twice, and then one for the final stab. So in this case, we'll go for tiny bleeding. As I have mentioned, Skyrim is grossly disproportionate on what they mean by their little markers here. Tiny is hospital worthy. Anything higher is lethal. So we're going to focus on having some tiny here, but play it as much as trying to keep the puddles focused. So we're going to have 2 tinies and 1 small. That looks like an exsanguinated person to me, don't y'all think? We will refresh as we always do, and it allows for a complete scene. Now, when we focus on decals, because vector is very specified on how we can do this, there is a lot going on with how it works. So too many decals can actually hinder your performance. So knowing when is too much is a key aspect that you'll have to learn in your own time, because depending on how many assets you've placed, how much lighting differences you've placed, how many different little things you've done, the number of decals you can place is varied. So you have to keep in mind all these little things. So we're going to keep some here. This is enough to show where he died. We also want to put a little spot where he got hurt. So he got shot in the foot before he died. So we will mark his escape and where things were placed. Person was shot with multiple arrows, so we are going to show the movement from where he was stabbed to a puddle to where he lands now. F5. And this woman will be exsanguinated here. Now, if you're wondering about some of these assets here because they are havocable, I have a script on them to keep them in place until someone picks them up and interacts. This is more of a dead corpse that has rotted, so we are going to go for dry. It's a little bit different. Looks about the same here, but in the game it's a bit different. So we allow for some dried blood to be there. And then here we have a mark where the point was severed. For some arterial splatter. To get that kind of detail. So now we've applied the blood decals we've relied on. We are now going to do other things. We're going to focus on now our regional light. But first, take a look at how our lighting complements the decals. We hide our markers, and it shows some detail for us. This person tried to crawl away after his first couple shots and was killed here. This person was impaled after being chased. This person was pinned down because she was a fighter and then executed. This one died in combat over here. And this one is a fan favorite of mine. Me being the fan, of course. This person was shot in the foot, tried to run for cover. When he tried to fight back, he was pinned down here, and since the man only brought a bow, his quiver of arrows, and a dagger with him, he finished him off by jabbing an arrow through his jugular, giving him his death scene. And the blood helps us determine how gruesome the death was. Now, we can now go to fog markers. So there are different types of cylindrical areas. So we can now have, so there's ambient beams. These, if I show the lines, are very specific. They're actually have lines that will tell you if they'll actually show up. Let's find. So this is a beam. When a light touches it, it'll keep its effect around it. So case in point, we'll have this here. Let's put the effects on here, and we'll put Bleak Falls light here. Shadow will not interact with it like we want to. We want an non-shadow. It'll interact. So this is a fog marker. This allows for us to see things like this. Now, we are not going to be using this. We're going to be focusing on different types of fog. So the one we're looking for is something, we're not looking for beams. We're going to be looking for this marker. We'll just place it in a region. We're not looking for these either. There's a specific kind. Just gotta remember how they did this. It's been a while since I've done some of these things. There is glowing fog, which shows how they go. So it's kind of a vector and a region. Let's see. Ah, that is a good line. Let's try mist. So we have beams, we have mist. There we go. So this is a cylindrical mist marker. This will tell us inside the cylinder the effect will be displayed. As we put it towards light, you will see we have this fog-like area. Drag it down closer, and it displays our scene a little bit more vividly. Creates this haunting, kind of spooky feeling to it. And as long as we keep it in this area, the light will actually pull it out. So you'll notice a lot of effects like this, such as cobwebs and a bunch of other things, will not show up in Skyrim until a light source is applied to it. This can either be a light source like you place here, or it can be your torch or a mage light spell. This helps us look at these visuals. Now, lastly, we're going to be focusing on drip effects because we're dealing with stalactites here. So stalactites, we kind of want a slow drip. Here's a little thing here. If the all symbol is here and selected, and if you put one letter, be ready to wait for a little bit. And don't be afraid to save often. So we're going to go for drips. If it was dripping into water, we would use drip splash. But in this case, we're dripping directly onto ground. So what we're going to be focusing on is drips here. So you'll see the top region here and the bottom region there. Using the Z, we can position it the way we want to. If we are careful about it, we can put this at the lowest point we are actually going to see the water effect hit. And this will be useful for us to see later on because this region here will tell us the location of where we should put our sound effect marker, which we'll be going over after this. This is a bit wider, so it's going to be dripping a little bit more. So we're going to use drips more, but this is not wide enough. So there is a wider option. There we have it. Little region where it drips. And believe it or not, I have to do this for almost every cave of mine with stalactites. So the more you know. We already did this one. Take this over here. Same to the stalactite set. There should be one more in this area. Right there. Now that I'm on drip, I can actually look at these sound effects. There's ambient, dungeon, cave drips, ALP, BLP, and all this. Now these are all different variations of how drips are. There's frequency, there's how fast, how common it is, and the different kinds of drips. The thing is, if you have the same drips in different areas, it's not necessarily captivating because drips are going to make some different sounds depending on what you're going for. So I try to mix it up every once in a while when I do this. I put an A around, and over here I might put a B. Because this is a large one, I try to put a little bit heavier one here. And here I will go back to A. This will allow for these kinds of sound effects. In this case, since most of our visual effects do not come with sound, looking for very silent things here, we have set up pretty much most of our sound effects. So what we have here area that did look a little bit bland. It might have been a little bit better with some of the decorations that I've placed, but the effects bring out much, much more than what it was in the very beginning. And so this is a little bit of proof that effects can go a long way of making a okay interior into an excellent interior. And to finish off this little talk here, since I'm actually going quite quick than I was expecting, I'm actually going to do a little walkthrough of this little area. So because of this, I'm going to have to switch between streaming platforms so you can hear and see everything that's going on. So we're going to stop streaming like this. Lock, I'm going to go to run SKSE, and I will start it up in 1 second. And then I'll answer questions for anyone still around. So, we have the following here. When you do a COC command, you're going to reference the cell's form ID, not its straight name in the game. So in this case, I named it AToMFX. Now, for purposes like this, I will CL, and I will also kill all, so it keeps everything constant. Looking around, we have our interior like this. It looks like our little guy flipped off his face, like off the stage here a little bit. And so the lighting is back to the case we needed it. It creates this ambient feel. People are still sprawled around, and it creates this little environment. If we go to settings here, we can change the display for more mobile friendly. We get closer. Sound is not running. This may be because... Did I save it? No, I did not. So all the changes were not showing. Let me run it back in. Second screen. Go back in apparently, because... And I cannot make Spookerus join us, unfortunately. But in this case, we are going to run with it anyway because I've already done all the technical work. So I'm doing my screen currently, so you're not going to hear the effects, but I'm going to switch it to Skyrim when I'm in. Now we are loading back in. There we go. So, can everyone hear?
Yep.
Hear the dripping? Now, if you carry a torch, you can see the dripping effects. Because every visual effect here requires a light source to be put against it. So if people who are carrying a torch can use the details around us to see what's going on, you can see the murder scene, how everyone was killed off, people were massacred, and our now dead little guy here who was watching his little display going on. Because I applied my lighting not too heavily, we see no flickering as an issue. If my lighting was done more generously, you may see flickering issues resolved from this. This is a fine balance that we will have to do in later little runs. Because too much light and things will flicker and it'll ruin the immersion. Too little light and the player can't see what they're doing unless they bring a torch. And depending on what you want, that is either good or bad. And before we end this off, one spooky note about the Tiber. Any questions from anyone? This is now an open discussion.
Is it possible to
let's say, start an interior already knowing more or less the areas that you will have? Like, what is your process when you have to think about like putting lights? Like, what is the first step and so on? You just
All
go
right.
to something that you made, or you have some
Understanding what you do first with lighting is you have to understand what things were placed. So first, before you do lighting templates, you have to figure out where you're going to place where your light sources are going to be. All right, and this is knowledge of what you've already done. So your lighting factors, where you're placing your little context clues for lighting, should come after most of your assets are placed down. Right, so you can create a more focused lighting template that works appropriately for you. All right.
Yep.
When this comes into play, this means that it's after you place down most of your meshes and your other little assets that help just describe what you're doing here. Then you'll start placing your lighting. And once you do that, you will see you'll see much less issues regarding the flickering, as long as you understand that you have to be conscious about where and how many lights you're placing. Any other questions?
Can you talk about the role for your development of this and how it incorporates with the writers? I mean, maybe for this you just made it all up on your own, but
I made it all up on my own, but I had some limitations because this was a Halloween-based stream. I had to come up with something that was a little bit more tense than I usually do. So I am known for more realistic cave lighting in my project. Most fans can be annoyed by me because I focus on more natural lighting. But in cases like this, it helps sell the environment a bit more, especially since I was trying to adopt a more tense environment where the players had a disadvantage. So we created a murder scene of a crazed little guy who is killing a bunch of people in here, as you saw, with all the corpses laid down. Because of this, we focus on what is happening, how we can portray it's happening without voices, because, a good level should be able to tell at least most of the story without any speech going on. All right? Because that helps sell the story a lot more when it comes from quest design. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The other question I would have is if somebody kind of writes this into the quest, are they writing all the details in terms of the personnel being murdered and like that, or is it just you kind of taking their work and going?
Kind of okay. I will say this with a little metaphor that some people might know. It takes two to do this. All right. If you're doing multiple things, it's correspondence that will help sell this correctly. All right. Case in point, even though I don't have a quest related to the cave I'm currently working for in Skyblivion, I keep in touch with a landscaper who works on the exterior around my cave. That way we can actually work on where our exits are being placed so I can rotate my cave properly. So we now have a apt path that has a realistic exit. All right? And it's because of my coordination with him that we actually have 3 different ways my cave intersects with the landscape. You can go in the natural way, you can drop down from a giant cave-in, and you can exit through the upper nibbin in my cave when everything is said and done.
I guess to help answer that question, because I know Pedro, you work on Skyblivion, there aren't a lot of writers in there.
Yeah.
To help answer that question, yeah, a quest designer would work with an area designer on the caves. Usually the caves are like, I'd say like a good portion of the caves are mostly built, and somebody correct me on this if I'm wrong, but usually like if I'm doing a quest design doc on a dungeon that's never been designed yet, then I'm going to be putting details like, okay, there's a big cave section here. There's an Iliad ruin, and this is where the king sat. And I put all that narrative and historical context in there. And usually, like the level design, it's just enough where the level designer can like go off it if they, yeah. It is usually a collaborative process, though. To
And
answer your
on
question.
top of that, because we don't have quest designers and we're going off the actual previous narrative of Oblivion in our project, I still have to go off a lot of the limitations the dungeons themselves had. So I had to focus on what flora it had. I had to focus on what people were there, what creatures were there, how that was set up. So essentially, what I'm doing when I do an interior for Skyblivion is I take every crucial bit of information as my limitations. All right. I cannot go farther than that area. But everything else is fair game as I move forward. So, case in point with Veon Cave, which is my claim for Skyblivion, the area is flooded in Veon Cave, and it gets more and more flooded as you get deeper. So I kept that. It is home to the Argonian tribesmen. I kept that. It is focused in Breville and had multiple interweaving paths. I kept that. But how they handled the flooding was lackluster. They did not explain how the flooding got there. They didn't explain how the flooding progresses. And they did not explain countless other factors. So my job as a level designer was to bring the reason flooding happens in this cave to a realistic standpoint. So what I ended up doing was that massive cave-in I talked about as a possible entrance is a water reservoir. And the water reservoir leaks in and out of the dungeon, constantly creating water flows that eventually lead to more flooded chambers that eventually intersect into the upper Nibbin. So it's a water reservoir that actually flows into a river. And this helps explain why the cave works the way it does. Does that make sense? As a quest designer, you'll be setting us limitations, but a level designer's job is to work with those limitations and try to make it the best they can do with the limitations in place. Because we cannot retcon your script.
Yeah, well said.
I'm sorry, I'm back. I had to bring in the groceries. I'm
All
sorry.
good. That's fine. Do you have any questions, Iphos?
Thing is, didn't hear anything else after the whole candle doing the candle thing.
So explaining the difference between intense light and faded light.
Yeah. And then also the wisp stalks.
Ah, yes. And you saw me move one of the sets of mushrooms because I knew it was going to hit the limit.
Yeah. And then after that, my mom and dad called me to bring me in to do the groceries. So yeah.
It is fair. We have no judgment there. Don't worry, man. Any other questions?
That Tiber is asking something.
All right. We have 15 minutes before the next stream starts. So unless that person wants to begin immediately, we can let Tiber answer any questions regarding NavMesh.
Just a quick explanation for anyone that doesn't know. NavMesh is a layer of geometry that then goes upon the surface of the well, in this case of the cave floor. Any rocks that the NPCs or AI can walk upon naturally. It exists in all games, just in different forms. In this case, if people see me talking about triangles, is because the NavMesh of Bethesda games takes the form of triangles. Actually, the NavMesh has not changed very much since Fallout 3. It's basically the exact same throughout all their games. So after a level is finished, I usually in at least in Skyblivion's case, then the interior designer will draw their own NavMesh, and basically anywhere they put it, they're telling the AI that they can walk upon it. They also draw cover. You can do so automatically or set it manually. So that tells the AI during a fight. Maybe they want to take cover. Maybe they're an archer and they want to get to a vantage point. Drawing cover will tell them which rock maybe has maximum cover. Maybe marks a cover as a ledge. What's lower, what's higher. Maybe there is a drop point, which is a lesser used edge marker in vanilla, where an NPC can actually, if it is faster, walk off of a cliff or make a small jump instead of making a long run around. Does anyone have questions on that? I think we're good to go. Move on.
All right. We'll have free talk for the next 14 minutes because Tyler sums it up in a minute.
How in depth is nav meshing? Like,
That depends
how
how depth do you
complicated?
want to go
How
with
complicated can you make the movements?
Well, the nav mesh doesn't really control. Well,
it depends on what your
I
nav
suppose
mesh is.
like what you mean by in depth. You can cover. You can use as many triangles as you want to cover the surface. It's sort of like a 3D model in itself. The nav mesh or navigational mesh. Well, with a 3D model, like the more polys you use, usually the more detailed the model is. Usually that means then for the nav mesh, like the more detailed you can make the mesh, and therefore the more detailed the map is for the AI to read, and they understand their environment better. However, just like with a high poly model, it takes more VRAM and memory to load and use it. It takes longer for the AI to read the entire nav mesh of the area to understand, and it starts mapping out more routes to take, which is generally unnecessary. So, and the point is, it's actually better to use less triangles to optimize it as much as possible. Because
So,
oh no, you go on.
Oh, so like technically speaking, you can make the AI seem really smart by having a lot of those triangles, but that would not be optimal because of performance issues and such, right?
Not only that, the smaller the triangle is, the harder it is for the AI to actually use it. So we try to prefer much larger triangles as possible so the AI can register it properly and work within its confines.
Yeah,
I see.
smaller and thinner.
And
So,
oh no, go ahead.
no, it's like having more nav mesh. It doesn't mean, I suppose, for like the AI suddenly it knows new, say, combat moves or whatnot. This is just really telling the AI, it's like, hey, everywhere where there is red is walkable. However, I think the most important aspect of nav mesh that's not widely talked about is that every triangle has a unique ID reference, just like every other item in game. So therefore, every triangle actually contributes to the overall reference limit of Skyrim. So this is an easy place to optimize. I think personally my best sell, I think the auto generation for creation kit is actually pretty bad. It has one, but it's not very good. It splurges. My best cell, I think the total number was 889 triangles in a cell.
Is that a lot or?
Yeah.
A lot.
Well, wait. I optimized it down to 65.
Oh damn.
So that is literally something like, it's like 700 off the top of my head. It's like, say, 700 items more that, say, Pedro can use in his cave.
Yeah.
700 more items to, like, maybe out in the landscape to bring to life. Items that can be used in the Imperial City, yada yada.
And to be fair, like the thing with a 700 assets, it's almost an entire cell for me. I can almost make an entire interior cell with 700 assets if given the limitations properly.
So if I understand correctly, these triangles really are important.
Yes, they are
Yes.
important.
I would say
NPCs
not
can't
to
move.
worry about learning NavMesh. It's actually quite simple. It looks complicated when you look at say you look like at the city of Whiterun, and you look at just the NavMesh. It looks scary because it looks all jumbled. But when you start out, it's actually quite simple. You just learn a little bit more, learn the hotkeys, and it feels a lot better.
Yeah, and on
Yeah.
top of that, I will say that though we joke around about nav mesh a lot, it is an important field and has to be done if we want anything to be more immersive in the environment, because nothing is immersion breaking as all NPCs standing in one spot doing nothing.
Or just walking into traps.
Oh, true. It's like yeah. In least case scenario, they don't understand their environment. They don't see like you and I do. They don't understand that there is a tree in front of them, or there is a wall here. There is a chair here. The AI, it's up to a nav mesher to like give space around the tree, give them a proper. It's like you don't just say you nav mesh sticking close to the tree. You also give it additional space. Because unfortunately the AI are not the brightest bulbs in gaming. So say you're walking past a pillar yourself in your home, and you bump your shoulder against it. Well, you're going to shrug that off and keep moving.
Yeah.
The AI, because of the collision, they'll bump their shoulder against the pillar and then just keep walking in place because the shoulder is now hooked onto the pillar. It's a little bit of an immersion break. I don't know about you, but it is for me.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So that's the thing. Eventually maybe their package says like, "Hey, you need to be eating dinner by this time," and then they will suddenly teleport out of that situation. It's not great. At the worst case scenario, yes, without the nav mesh, the AI cannot function. So perhaps you've seen in some streams of Skyblivion where Kyle is walking around and there are angry enemies just standing in place, but they do not engage him. They do not fight back.
Because the nav mesh is not ready.
Yeah, there is no nav mesh there. Quests cannot fire. I don't even think the NPCs can speak if you try to talk to them. So they'll just stand there.
Dumb.
So, and essentially without nav mesh, it's easy, but it's a tedious thing depending on how much there is to do. Especially for these new land mods like the BS and Skyblivion. There's quite a bit. That's why it's important to gain more members so that the work can be split up even more.
Yeah. By the way, I saw I think someone in chat also asked a question about this. Don't know if that has already been answered, but
Hokage, is there procedural nav meshing where the AI constantly scans a small area around itself? There isn't active nav meshing in game. It's like the nav mesh can only be set from the creation kit beforehand. Although in game nav mesh is a temporary reference. So when you are, say you're within an area, say around Whiterun, the nav mesh is not loading, say in Solitude, so it's not active all the time. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah,
we have a short period of time left before Sayoli takes over. One last thing I would like to mention is that depending on what you're doing with nav mesh, it can be very simple or very complicated. So the basic nav mesh itself is not bad at all, but once you factor in things like drop points, preferred pathing, water nav mesh, and a bunch of other things, there's many different things that revolve around nav mesh that can be quite tedious and quite involved. But once you master it, it's something that it's kind of like riding a bicycle. It's not like you're going to struggle with it that much anymore once you figure out how to get it to work, as long as something is possible. Because there are some interiors that have been done, some levels that have been created that's almost impossible for a nav mesher to actually nav mesh properly because the way it's stacked against it.
I see.
Does nav mesh? But Hokage asked, does nav mesh respond to states? do you mean like a downstate? I'm not sure if you could extrapolate on that. Tars asked if anyone asked us, does the size of the triangle make any difference? I'd say the only difference is it's worse the smaller and thinner they are. It's harder for the AI to read them and understand. So that's why if you've ever seen me joking around like I like big, thick triangles, I'm not exaggerating. The bigger they are, the better. But of course, you rarely get landscape that's just straight flat lands. If you do, you got to talk to your landscaper about what he's doing. But in general, you try the best you can do. You try to optimize as best you can and use big triangles where you can. The nav mesh does not always have to be. It's best when it's flat against the land. It does not always have to follow every dip, every hill. There is room to just kind of slip underneath a little bit. There's room to maneuver. The only problem when it is a big problem, it's when it's like 6 feet underground or in the air. I'd say maybe a foot off the ground is when you're going to start seeing problems, but it's best to
Timer,
avoid that by just flattening it.
Timer, like a voice text. That seems more like a script, and you can identify that with assets. And it's a lot more complicated to make them run into water naturally. That's a much more involved process that will involve scripting, nav meshing, and the level itself. It's very difficult to get immersive behavior like that, but if it's coordinated properly, I don't see it being impossible.
I do believe there was a mod like that well, I don't think it was quite with the AI, but I do remember seeing a mod something about if you go into water nav mesh or whatever, you are protected from fire.
That is a nice little thing, yeah. Or fire damage is reverted.
Mm-hmm.
Like the effect little thing. Alright, now that we have 3 minutes until Sayoli's turn, we are going to pass it off to him.